I paused at the edge of the aisle, clutching the bouquet meant for his graduation. Laughter buzzed around me, but his voice cut clean through it. Don't save her a seat, she's irrelevant. My grandson didn't even glance my way. The balloons, the flash of cameras, the proud families. It all blurred behind the sting of those two words. After years of birthday cards, bedtime stories, and college savings, I was a shadow, a mistake, a ghost in heels. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The scent of roasted chicken and buttered rolls drifted through the banquet hall, clinging to the air with a warmth that should have felt welcoming. Crystal chandeliers glowed above rows of neatly dressed tables, each one buzzing with chatter and the scrape of silverware. Eleanor Whitmore stepped carefully across the polished floor, her heels making a muted click against the hardwood. At 74, she carried herself with the calm dignity of a woman who had once commanded full classrooms. Though her back ached faintly from the weight of years, tonight she had expected celebration, not spectacle. Her eyes scanned the crowd for the small white placard with her name. The community association always reserves seats for longtime members, and she had attended these banquets for decades, ever since her husband was alive. Somewhere among the clinking glasses and laughter, her family was already seated. She spotted them halfway down the long row. Her son Cal, with his shoulders slightly hunched, his wife Megan straight-backed in a silk blouse, and David, her grandson, lounging with the ease of someone who believed the room revolved around him. Eleanor lifted her hand to wave, expecting at least a nod of recognition. Instead, she heard David's voice cut through the noise, sharp and mocking, pitched just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Don't save her a seat, he announced, grinning at his friends. She's irrelevant. The word hit like a slap, its sting echoing longer than the laughter that followed. A few at the table chuckled politely, unsure whether to join in. Megan smirked into her wine glass, her painted lips curling as if in agreement. Cal shifted uncomfortably, eyes fixed on the centerpiece as though pretending not to hear might erase the moment. Eleanor stopped mid-step, her chest tightening beneath her neatly pressed jacket. The chatter around her didn't falter, plates clattered, silverware chimed, conversations rolled on. Yet in her ears there was only the hollow echo of her grandson's voice. She considered walking out, but her feet moved forward slowly, almost in defiance. She reached the end of the row, saw no empty chair, and without a word, turned toward the wall. There, at a small side table reserved for overflow guests, she lowered herself onto the cushioned chair. She arranged her skirt with precise care, lifting her chin as if nothing had pierced her. Still, her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded her napkin. From across the room, Martha Klein caught her eye. Martha, her lifelong friend and fellow choir member, was already bristling, her jaw set as if she might march across the floor and scold the boy herself. Eleanor gave the faintest shake of her head, urging restraint. The evening carried on with speeches, raffle prizes, and a steady hum of polite applause. Eleanor tasted none of it. The chicken grew cold on her plate, the vegetables soft and unappealing. Each laugh from David's table carried across the room like a splinter, yet she sat upright, posture impeccable, her faint smile masking the truth from anyone who dared glance her way. When Cal finally rose to fetch dessert, he avoided her gaze, moving as though burdened by weights too heavy to carry. Megan leaned close to David, whispering something that made him snort with amusement. Not once did they acknowledge the woman sitting only yards away, as though she had already been erased from their circle. Eleanor lifted her water glass, the cool condensation dampening her fingers. She remembered her husband's steady hand at similar banquets, his soft-spoken pride whenever she was introduced as one of the district's most dedicated teachers. How different the world felt without him beside her. She sipped slowly, the chill cutting through the dryness in her throat, and set the glass back down with deliberate calm. Martha eventually slid into the empty chair beside her, cheeks flushed with restrained fury. The nerve of that boy, she hissed under her breath. In public, no less. Eleanor dabbed at the corner of her lips with her napkin, her expression unreadable. The room seemed to blur, voices swelling into an indistinct hum as she focused only on Martha's indignant eyes. "They think they've erased me," she said softly, her voice almost too even, too calm. She leaned just enough that Martha could hear the words meant for no one else. "But they'll learn soon enough. I can erase them too. And when I do, it won't be with laughter." Martha blinked, startled by the steel in Eleanor's tone. The room around them clinked and murmured on, oblivious. David's laughter rang out again from across the hall, unaware of the promise just spoken in the shadows of the wall. The car's interior was heavy with silence, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the faint squeak of Martha's windshield wipers clearing away the misty drizzle. Martha's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles pale in the dashboard glow. She hadn't spoken for the first few blocks, as if restraining herself, but the words finally burst out, sharp and furious. "That boy humiliated you, Eleanor." In front of half the town, her voice cut through the dark like glass breaking. "And it isn't the first time." "Oh no, I've kept count." Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, her posture as neat as it had been in the banquet hall, but her silence carried weight. She looked out the window at Tulsa's damp streets, blurred neon signs reflecting in the puddles. The laughter still echoed faintly in her ears, but she betrayed nothing. Martha wasn't finished. "Remember last Christmas? He didn't even bother to say thank you for the sweater you knitted. Left it in the box, tags and all. And the summer before, at your own birthday dinner, he was on his phone the entire time, whispering to Megan about how old people's stories don't matter." She let out a disgusted snort. "Irrelevant, my foot. He's been rehearsing that line for years." The windshield fogged as the heater pushed warm air into the car. Eleanor drew a slow breath, exhaling softly, her fingers folded in her lap. She hadn't forgotten those moments. How could she? But tonight's slight had sliced deeper, public and deliberate. By the time Martha pulled into Eleanor's driveway, the drizzle had thickened to rain. The two women hurried inside, the sharp scent of cedar and lavender greeting them as Eleanor switched on the warm glow of the living room lamp. Without a word, she moved across the rug and bent down to unlock a cedar chest that sat beneath the window. Its brass hinges creaked faintly as she lifted the lid. Martha hovered nearby, arms crossed, her fury still simmering. "What are you doing?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She pulled out a stack of old photographs, sepia-tinted portraits of ancestors who had carved out a place in Oklahoma long before David was born. There were letters, too, tied with ribbon, her late husband's handwriting slanting across yellowed paper. Jewelry boxes, medals, even a delicate lace handkerchief her grandmother had carried to her own wedding. Each item had been intended to pass through Cal to David, a continuation of family history. Eleanor's hand lingered over a small wooden box. She opened it to reveal her husband's pocket watch, the one he carried to school assemblies when she was still teaching. The tick of memory seemed louder than the storm outside. Martha leaned over her shoulder, her voice softer now, but edged with conviction. "Do you see it? All this, every photo, every letter, every keepsake. He doesn't deserve it. He doesn't even care about it. If it isn't money or attention, it means nothing to him." Eleanor touched the worn leather cover of her husband's Bible, running her finger across the faded gold lettering of his name. She didn't open it, just let her hand rest there, feeling the weight of legacy in something so simple. "Richard believed in memory," she murmured, in passing things forward. Martha's reply was immediate, unwavering. "Then pass it to someone worthy. It's time to choose Eleanor, who deserves to be remembered and who doesn't." The storm rattled against the window panes, a steady percussion underscoring the moment. Eleanor lowered the Bible back into the chest with care, closed the lid, and locked it once more. She rose, straightened her back, and crossed to the telephone on the small oak table. Her fingers hovered for only a moment before dialing a familiar number. The line clicked, and a measured voice answered. James O'Connor's office. "This is Eleanor Whitmore," she said calmly, her voice carrying the steadiness of a woman who had just made a decision she would not undo. "I need an urgent appointment." The office smelled faintly of leather and polished oak, the kind of scent that carried weight and permanence. Shelves lined with law books rose behind James O'Connor's desk, their spines darkened from years of use. Diplomas framed in walnut hung in neat rows, and case files sat stacked in tidy towers across the credenza. The tick of a brass clock filled the quiet space, steady as a gavel. Eleanor sat across from James, her handbag resting on her lap, hands folded neatly over it. She looked like any other elderly widow making routine arrangements, but her eyes held a calm fire. James had seen widows before, clients trembling at the thought of change, but Eleanor was different. She wasn't here out of fear. She was here to decide the future. "Tell me what happened," James said, leaning back, his tone patient but probing. Eleanor recounted the banquet in measured detail, David's voice cutting through the room, Megan's smirk, Cal's silence. She didn't embellish or dramatize. Her words were precise, each one delivered with the composure of a woman who had been teaching history her entire life. Yet when she repeated David's phrase, irrelevant, her jaw tightened ever so slightly, the only crack in her composure. James nodded slowly, steepling his fingers. "You've been holding on to this decision for longer than tonight, haven't you?" Eleanor tilted her head. "I've been waiting for proof. Tonight, he gave it to me." The lawyer's lips curved faintly, not in amusement, but in recognition. "Then the question is, do you want symbolic erasure or legal obliteration?" His voice carried no judgment, only the clarity of a man accustomed to watching families devour themselves over inheritance. Her answer came without hesitation. "Both." James opened a drawer, sliding out a fresh folder. He laid a pen across the blank paper as though setting the stage. "Very well. We'll begin with your will. You want him excluded by name?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "No room for interpretation. His name should be written only once, so that history knows he was denied." The pen scratched across the paper as James took notes. His office was so quiet that every stroke echoed, like chiseling words into stone. Eleanor watched as he outlined the redistribution of her estate, the trust funds, the property rights. All the heirlooms, the quilts, the silver, the land, everything that David had likely already counted as his, would no longer touch his hands. When James asked where she would like the money redirected, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, where the afternoon sun cast long slants of light across the office floor. "A scholarship," she said, "in Richard's name. History students. Those who want to preserve memory instead of discarding it." James's pen paused mid-stroke, his expression softening. "A fitting tribute," she nodded, her voice steady. "If David wants to erase me, then let the world remember Richard instead. That will be his punishment, watching the family name honored without him." For nearly an hour they refined the details, James occasionally adjusting his glasses as he wrote. The scholarship would be endowed through the university, the funds locked beyond challenge. Eleanor's assets would transfer with precision. There would be no loopholes, no appeals to sentiment. When James finally set down his pen, the folder was thick with fresh pages, signatures waiting to be made. He studied Eleanor, searching her face for any trace of doubt. Instead, he saw something resolute, something unshakable. "You understand what this means?" he asked. "You'll be making it public soon enough. A grandson cut out so cleanly, it won't stay quiet for long." Eleanor lifted her chin, her eyes steady. "Let it spread. Silence has protected him long enough." James leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. His smile was subtle, almost conspiratorial, as though he relished watching entitlement collapse under its own arrogance. "We'll serve notice quietly," he said at last, his voice low and deliberate. "But word will spread fast. The knock at David Whitmore's apartment door was sharp and deliberate, the kind that carried official weight. He shuffled over, barefoot, and pulled it open to find a mail carrier holding a clipboard with a thick envelope stamped certified mail. "Sign here," the carrier said, voice flat with routine. David scrawled his name, already smirking, then tore the envelope open before the man even stepped away. The pages inside bore seals and signatures, each line dense with legal authority. His eyes skimmed, then slowed, the words landing like punches. Excluded by name, removed as heir. Funds redirected to establish the Richard Whitmore Legacy Scholarship. David barked out a laugh, jagged and loud in the small apartment. "You've got to be kidding me." He waved the documents like a victory flag, pacing toward the couch. "Megan, get a look at this. The old woman thinks she can cut me out." Megan stepped from the kitchen, wineglass in hand. She leaned close, scanning the papers, her expression hardening with each line. By the time she reached the notarized seal, her lips had flattened into a straight line. "This isn't some draft," she said. "It's final." She had it filed. David tossed the packet onto the coffee table, as if it were junk mail. "It won't stick. She's senile. Some lawyer probably filled her head with nonsense. I'll fight it, and she'll fold." But Megan didn't answer. Her silence said she wasn't as confident as he was. The next night, Cal showed up at Eleanor's porch, rain dripping from his coat collar. He knocked softly, almost timidly, before she opened the door. His face looked worn, weighed down by conflict. "Mom," he began, stepping inside. "We need to talk." The living room smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh brewed tea. Eleanor gestured toward a chair, her expression steady. Cal sat, but didn't relax, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. "This is too far," he said. "David's upset, Megan's furious, and now the whole town's talking. You've humiliated him." Eleanor's voice was calm, but firm. "He humiliated me first, California. In front of everyone. He's just young," Cal protested, looking anywhere but at her. "Young men know respect," she said, her tone slicing through his excuses. "David knew exactly what he was doing. And now he knows exactly what I've done." Cal exhaled, sagging into the chair. He had no answer for that. Later that week, Eleanor and Martha carried boxes into the Tulsa History Museum, their shoes clicking on the marble floors. The scent of varnish and paper hung in the cool air as curators welcomed them with white gloves and clipboards. Inside the boxes were quilts Eleanor had kept for decades, each one stitched with family memory. "You really want to give them away?" Martha asked as Eleanor gently unfolded one patterned with autumn leaves. "These don't belong shut away," Eleanor replied. "They belong where people will see them, where memory lives." Martha's eyes softened. "You're doing more for legacy than David ever will." That Sunday, the Tulsa Civic Center bustled with neighbors arriving for the community luncheon. The air buzzed with chatter and the clink of coffee cups, trays of sandwiches and cookies set out on folding tables. Eleanor walked in quietly with Martha, heads turning to greet her with smiles and polite nods. David and Megan arrived late, striding in with forced confidence. David's grin widened as if daring anyone to challenge him. But the moment he stepped into the lobby, his eyes locked on the gleaming bronze plaque mounted near the entrance. "In memory of Richard Whitmore, Legacy Scholarship Fund." The words were crisp, permanent, impossible to look past. Conversation swelled as neighbors pointed it out, murmuring admiration. "Beautiful tribute," someone whispered nearby. Another added, "Richard would be proud." David's jaw tightened, the color draining from his face. For the first time, laughter didn't come. His reflection stared back at him from the polished bronze, smaller than he imagined himself to be. David stood frozen, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the words. Megan touched his arm, her voice low but edged with venom. "She's making us look like fools." His body jolted like a spring wound too tight. Without a word, he shoved past her and stormed through the lobby doors, the autumn air hitting him like a slap. The glass thudded closed behind him, cutting off the polite chatter. Megan hurried after him, her heels clacking against the concrete. "David, stop!" Everyone saw that. "Good," he snapped, pacing furiously toward the parking lot. "Let them see. She thinks she can erase me? I'll show her what happens when you try to humiliate me." Megan's grip tightened on her purse strap, her voice low and sharp. "You're letting her win. She's controlling the story, painting herself as noble while we're the villains." David spun, eyes blazing. "Then we change the story." That evening, Cal drove to Eleanor's house. He lingered on the porch, shoulders slumped, before finally knocking. When she opened the door, her face was calm, unreadable, her hair neatly pinned. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen. Martha sat at the table, a book in her lap, raising her brows when she saw Cal's weary expression. Cal didn't sit right away. He hovered, running his hands down the front of his jacket as if rehearsing words. "Mom, you can't keep doing this." Eleanor tilted her head. "Doing what?" "This," he said, motioning vaguely. "The plaque, the scholarship. Cutting David out so harshly. It's extreme. He's young. He doesn't think before he speaks." Eleanor poured him coffee, sliding the cup across the table without spilling a drop. "Respect isn't complicated, Cal." David knew exactly what he was saying. He chose mockery, and now he lives with its cost. Cal's jaw tensed. "He's your grandson." Eleanor's voice stayed steady, her eyes never leaving his. "And I am his grandmother. That bond should have meant something to him before he called me irrelevant." Martha gave a small, approving hum from her chair. "She's been more patient than most would." Cal sat down heavily, staring into the dark swirl of his coffee. He had no rebuttal. 2 nights later, David showed up at Eleanor's door. His pounding fists rattled the frame, each thud reverberating down the hallway. Eleanor opened it, Martha again at her side. David's face was red, his expression twisted with fury. "You can't erase me from this family." His voice was raw, carrying through the quiet street. Eleanor studied him, her gaze unflinching. "I already did." The words landed with the weight of finality. David's breath caught, his fists trembling at his sides. But before he could speak again, Eleanor closed the door slowly, the latch clicking with calm precision. 2 days later, Eleanor returned to James O'Connor's law office. His desk was stacked with fresh papers, the faint scent of leather and ink heavy in the air. He adjusted his glasses, his usual composure edged with gravity. "There's something you need to see," James said, sliding a document across the desk. Eleanor leaned forward, Martha beside her, both women scanning the heading. "Petition to determine mental competency." James tapped the paper lightly. "David filed this yesterday. He's asking the court to declare you unfit. If he convinces a judge, your new will could be void," Martha gasped, clutching the armrest of her chair. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She lifted the document, her eyes narrowing with quiet resolve. "So that's his next move," she said evenly. "Then it's time to show him just how sharp my mind still is." The examination room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper, the air cool and still. A stack of test sheets sat on the desk, pencils lined neatly beside them. Eleanor Whitmore took her seat with the same calm precision she'd once used to begin her history lectures, smoothing the front of her jacket. Across from her, the evaluator, a middle-aged psychiatrist with careful eyes, adjusted his glasses and clicked his pen. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "we'll run through a series of exercises. Nothing you haven't seen before, but I'll ask you to listen carefully." Eleanor folded her hands neatly on the table. "I've listened carefully for 74 years, she replied, her voice cool and steady. "You'll find I haven't stopped." The test began. Word recall, puzzle sequences, drawing a clock face, interpreting proverbs. Eleanor moved through each task with the patience of a teacher correcting a paper. When asked to remember a list of words, she not only repeated them back, but rearranged them alphabetically. When given a story problem, She solved it and then noted a historical parallel, causing the evaluator's brow to rise with quiet surprise. The hours stretched, punctuated by the scratch of pencil on paper and the faint hum of the building's air system. Yet Eleanor never faltered. Her voice remained firm, her eyes sharp, her wit cutting through each prompt with measured precision. By the time she finished, the evaluator leaned back in his chair, pen tapping thoughtfully against his notepad. "Most people your age average a moderate score," he said carefully. "You've exceeded expectations, significantly." Eleanor allowed the faintest smile. "I taught for 40 years. Memory is a muscle. Mine never stopped working." The affidavit was submitted the following week in probate court. The room was hushed, the scent of paper and polished wood mingling with the low murmur of voices. Eleanor sat at the petitioner's table with James at her side, her posture as straight as a ruler. Across the aisle, David fidgeted restlessly, his tie slightly askew, Megan's glare fixed like a blade from the gallery behind him. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver hair pinned in a bun, adjusted her glasses as she read the report aloud. "Results indicate Mrs. Whitmore exhibits no signs of cognitive decline. In fact, her scores rank well above average for her age group. There is no evidence to support claims of diminished capacity." The words landed like thunder in the silent room. David's face flushed crimson. He leaned toward Megan, muttering furiously, "This is rigged." She knew the answers ahead of time. Megan didn't answer, but her expression, tight-lipped and cold, was enough. She stared daggers at Eleanor, her nails tapping a staccato rhythm against her chair. At the defense table, Martha leaned slightly toward Eleanor, her whisper just audible. "Checkmate already." Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile, but her eyes remained fixed on the judge, betraying nothing more. The judge sat, the affidavit aside, and looked directly at David. "Mr. Whitmore, unless you have further credible evidence, this petition is hereby dismissed." David rose halfway from his chair, his voice breaking in frustration. "She's manipulating you. Everyone in this town sees her as some saint, but she's—" The judge's gavel cracked against the wood. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore. This matter is closed." The gallery stirred with murmurs, neighbors exchanging glances, some barely disguising their smirks. David slumped back, seething, his jaw grinding as if he could chew through the verdict itself. When the hearing adjourned, James gathered his papers calmly, his movements precise, deliberate. Eleanor rose beside him, unshaken, her composure as steady as when she'd first walked in. David avoided her eyes, Megan dragging him by the arm toward the door, their pace clipped with fury. Outside the courtroom, James held the door for Eleanor and Martha, his expression thoughtful. "You did exactly what you needed to," he said quietly, though there was no triumph in his tone. Instead, his gaze was sharp, calculating, already on the next step. Martha exhaled, adjusting her purse strap. "He's cornered. He can't touch her now." James shook his head slightly. "Don't be so sure. Men like David don't accept defeat. He won't stop here. Expect escalation." Eleanor paused in the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing above, her reflection glimmering faintly in the courthouse glass. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were cold with certainty. "Then let him escalate. He'll only climb higher, before the fall." The smear campaign began with a single post. David sat hunched at his laptop, the blue glow of the screen reflecting in his restless eyes. His fingers flew across the keys, typing words that dripped with venom. "My grandmother isn't well. She's forgetful, bitter, clinging to old grudges. It's sad, really, watching someone lose touch with reality." He hit publish and watched the comments trickle in, some sympathetic, others curious. Within hours, the post spread across neighborhood forums and community groups. By evening, whispers had begun. At the senior center, where Eleanor had volunteered for years, conversations turned sharper, glances more probing. Did you hear what her grandson said? One woman murmured over a bridge game. Maybe that's why she's acting so strangely. Another added, it would explain why she's been giving things away. The words slithered through the air, carried by suspicion. Eleanor felt the shift. She noticed the hushed tones when she entered, the way smiles stretched thinner, politeness stiffening into something brittle. Yet she moved with the same quiet grace, her chin held high, never breaking stride. Martha, however, burned with fury. He's poisoning the well, she muttered as they left the center one afternoon, her umbrella snapping open against a drizzle. Lies travel faster than truth, but truth lasts longer. Don't let him drag you down to his level. I won't, Eleanor replied calmly. If he wants to spend his nights spinning stories, let him. I've lived mine in daylight. The following week, Eleanor hosted her quilting circle in her living room. The house smelled of cinnamon bread and fresh coffee, the low hum of conversation blending with the soft snip of scissors and the pull of thread through fabric. Laughter filled the room, warm and bright, drowning out the rumors that clung outside her walls. When someone hesitated, mentioning they'd heard talk about her health, Eleanor chuckled lightly, leaning back in her chair. If I've lost my mind, then this quilt must be sewing itself. The room erupted in laughter, the tension unraveling stitch by stitch. Her wit, her steady hands, her unshaken presence, they spoke louder than David's digital slander. Meanwhile, James O'Connor was not content to let the lies circulate unchecked. In his office, he drafted a letter sharp enough to cut glass. Words like defamation and malicious intent lined the page, his tone precise, his intent clear. He filed a formal notice attaching screenshots of David's posts, preparing for the next legal strike. This will force him to either retract or defend his lies, James explained to Eleanor when she visited his office. His voice carried a quiet satisfaction, like a craftsman sharpening a blade. Eleanor listened, nodding, but her attention was elsewhere. The battle was no longer just in courtrooms or paperwork. It was in the eyes of her neighbors, the narrative of her town. 2 days later, as Eleanor walked out of the grocery store, a young woman approached, a recorder in one hand, camera bag slung across her shoulder. She was in her early 30s, her expression alert and curious. Mrs. Whitmore, she asked. I'm Lila Rhodes, reporter with the Tulsa Times. I've been following the stories circulating about you, both the legal dispute and the community scholarship. Eleanor adjusted the strap of her purse, studying the reporter with cool eyes. Stories or rumors? Both, Lila admitted. But I'd rather hear yours. People are listening. They deserve more than whispers and online posts. They deserve the truth, Martha, who was carrying Eleanor's bag of groceries, eyed the reporter warily. Careful, Eleanor. Reporters can twist a word faster than David can post a lie. But Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. She held Lila's eyes, her composure ironclad, her faint smile carrying the weight of someone who'd already decided. Let him see what relevance looks like, she said evenly. The knock on Eleanor's front door came brisk and purposeful. When she opened it, Lila Rhodes stood with a camera slung over her shoulder, notepad tucked beneath her arm. The young reporter's eyes flicked around the porch, at the geraniums blooming stubbornly in clay pots, at the wreath of hand-stitched fabric squares hanging neatly on the door. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Mrs. Whitmore, Lila said, her tone respectful but keen. I promise to keep your words your own. Inside, the living room glowed with the warm lamplight of late afternoon. Quilts draped over chairs, bookshelves heavy with volumes of history and literature. The faint smell of lemon polish and brewing tea mingled with the sweetness of cinnamon rolls cooling on the counter. Eleanor gestured for Lila to sit. Her movements calm, composed. You can look around, Eleanor said, easing into her chair. If you're going to write about me, better you see what matters. Lila's camera clicked softly as she photographed the quilts stacked in careful piles. The hand-stitched seams vibrant with decades of memory. She captured the spines of books worn from Eleanor's teaching years, margins marked with notes in careful handwriting. On the mantel sat Richard's pocket watch and a framed black and white wedding photo, the glass polished to a shine. "Tell me about him," Lila prompted, nodding toward the picture. Eleanor's voice softened. "Richard believed that legacy wasn't in wealth. It was in memory, in what you left others to carry. He supported every quilt I stitched, every lesson I taught. He believed history is a quilt itself, patched together from lives worth remembering." Lila scribbled notes furiously, her pen scratching against the pad. "And teaching?" Eleanor allowed herself a faint smile. 40 years in the classroom. I watched children walk in restless and leave curious. If I gave them that curiosity, then I did my job. David." She paused, adjusting her teacup. David never wanted to listen. He only wanted to inherit. Lila lowered her pen for a moment. "Do you want me to print that?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. Truth doesn't need whispering. 2 days later, the Tulsa Times carried the headline across its lifestyle section. "Matriarch preserves legacy while cutting out the noise." The article painted Eleanor as a woman of grace and resilience, someone who had chosen memory over bitterness, permanence over pettiness. Lila's photographs added weight, the colorful quilts draped like banners of legacy, Eleanor's hands resting calmly on a stack of books, the soft light catching Richard's watch on the mantel. The town devoured it. At the senior center, neighbors passed the paper across tables, remarking at how dignified Eleanor looked. At the grocery store, strangers paused to compliment her. Online, comments piled up praising her strength. Words like role model and backbone threaded through the digital chatter. Eleanor didn't boast or even mention the article. She let the community speak for her. Martha, though, folded the paper neatly and set it on the coffee table like a trophy. "He tried to make you invisible," she said with a smirk. "Now you're plastered on every breakfast table in town." Across the city, David scrolled through the article on his phone, his jaw tight, thumb jabbing at the screen. Every photograph felt like salt in an open wound. The comments, the praise, the subtle ridicule of him between the lines. He slammed the phone face down on the table. "She's turning into a saint," Megan muttered, arms crossed, her own face pale with resentment. David's glare darkened. "Saints fall just like everyone else, and I'll be the one to push her." That evening, Eleanor sat in her kitchen with Martha, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. A knock rattled the back door. Cal, his face drawn, shoulders sagging. He stepped inside, looking older than his years. "Mom," he began, his voice gravelly with unease. "You should be careful." Eleanor set her teacup down, eyeing him steadily. "Careful of what?" Cal glanced toward the window as though afraid of being overheard. "David's planning something worse. I don't know what, but I can see it in him. He won't stop until he breaks you." The pawn shop smelled of dust and tarnished brass, a place where forgotten things waited to be bartered into oblivion. David slid the velvet-lined box across the glass counter, his smirk faint but fixed. Inside gleamed Eleanor's heirloom silverware, delicate engravings catching the flicker of fluorescent lights. Pieces that had graced holiday tables for 3 generations now lay stripped of their history, priced for quick cash. The shop owner inspected the silver with practiced disinterest, weighing forks and spoons in his hand, tapping at the register. "Antique pattern, you'll get decent money," he said. "Just hurry up," David snapped, his knee bouncing beneath the counter. The clink of metal against glass was sharp, final. He walked out minutes later with a wad of bills stuffed into his pocket, the bell above the door jingling as though mocking him. 2 days later, Eleanor sat in James O'Connor's office when the phone on his desk rang. James answered, listened, then leaned back slowly in his chair, his expression sharpening. "Pawn shop records," he said after hanging up. "The police traced your silverware. David sold it last week." The words landed heavy, though Eleanor's face remained composed, only the faint tightening of her jaw betraying her anger. Martha, sitting beside her, let out a disgusted hiss. Stealing from your grandmother? He's crossed every line. James was already drafting paperwork, his fountain pen gliding swiftly across the page. We'll file theft charges immediately. He needs to learn the law doesn't bend to entitlement. Eleanor only nodded, her silence cold and unyielding. News spread quickly. At the Civic Center Cafe, whispers circled as neighbors stirred their coffee, shaking their heads. He sold her silver. Who does that to family? The story was out before David could spin it, his reputation corroding faster than he could patch it. At home, Megan paced the living room, her voice sharp with panic. You didn't tell me you took the silver, she hissed, clutching a wine glass like it was an anchor. Now the police are involved. Do you understand what this means? David slouched on the couch, thumbing through his phone. It's just property. She doesn't even use it anymore. She'll drop it once Dad talks to her. But Megan wasn't convinced. Her voice trembled at the edges. You've dragged us into a scandal. Do you think people won't look at me differently too? David didn't answer. His silence was a stubborn shield, but his tapping foot betrayed nerves he couldn't mask. That evening, Cal stood in Eleanor's kitchen, the scent of simmering tea filling the air. He looked broken, wringing his hands as he pleaded. Mom, please, don't press charges. He's already humiliated enough. If you send this to court, it'll ruin him. Eleanor poured the tea into porcelain cups with steady hands, the faint clink of ceramic against saucer echoing in the quiet. She set one cup in front of her son, then sat down opposite him. Cal leaned forward, desperate. You can make this go away. Just say the word. It's your silverware, after all, but Eleanor didn't speak. Her eyes were cool, her face impassive, as still as carved stone. Cal's voice cracked with urgency, but Eleanor's silence was louder than anything he said. Martha, seated nearby, finally broke the stalemate. He stole from her California. This isn't about forgiveness, it's about consequences. Cal's shoulders slumped. He looked between the two women, realizing there would be no reprieve. The next night, David sat in his apartment, blinds drawn, the air thick with stale beer and resentment. He muttered under his breath, replaying conversations in his head, convinced he was the victim of some grand betrayal. Megan had gone silent, retreating into a cold corner of the room with her glass. A sudden pounding rattled the door. Not frantic, official, heavy, the kind that carried authority. David froze, his beer halfway to his lips. Police, a voice barked. Open up, we have a warrant. Megan's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. David's eyes widened as the pounding came again, harder this time, the sound reverberating through the small apartment like a drumbeat of reckoning. You don't have the right, David barked, but his voice faltered as an officer held up a worn leather photo album, its cover scratched but recognizable. Another pulled a small jewelry box from under the bed, its velvet casing faded but intact. Bag them, one officer ordered. The clink of evidence bags being sealed punctuated the room, final and methodical. David lunged forward, veins straining in his neck. That's mine, she gave me those years ago. The officer ignored him, methodically cataloging the items. Megan's breathing grew shallow, her wine-stained blouse wrinkled as she whispered, David, please, just stop. But David only growled, the walls closing in tighter with every discovery. Later that afternoon, Eleanor was summoned to the precinct. She entered the evidence room with measured steps, the scent of paper and cold steel heavy in the air. Martha was at her side, her lips pressed into a thin line. On the table lay the photo albums, jewelry boxes, and trinkets that once sat safely in Eleanor's cedar chest. The officer in charge gestured. Mrs. Whitmore, we'll need confirmation of ownership before these can be returned. Eleanor lowered herself into the chair, her hands steady as stone. She opened the first album, fingers grazing the photographs. Her wedding day, Richard in uniform, Cal as a boy with freckles across his nose. The images felt warm despite the sterile surroundings. Yes, she said quietly. These are mine. One by one, she signed the forms, her pen strokes precise, unwavering. The jewelry boxes followed, the one Richard had gifted her on their 30th anniversary, the one that had belonged to her grandmother. Each signature was not just proof, but reclamation. Martha leaned closer, murmuring with dry wit. "Looks like relevance is spelled in ink, not tantrums." Eleanor's lips twitched, but her eyes remained hard, fixed on the items David had tried to erase her with. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The scent of old wood and polished brass filled the air, whispers rustling like leaves in the gallery. David sat at the defendant's table, jaw set, his lawyer pale and nervous. Eleanor sat across the aisle, posture regal, Martha at her side. James O'Connor organized his papers with calm precision, his glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. The judge, stern and deliberate, entered and reviewed the affidavit. "Theft charges have been substantiated," she announced. "All recovered items are to be returned to Mrs. Whitmore immediately." David shot to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. "This is ridiculous," his voice cracked, raw with fury. "It's still family property. She's mine to inherit from. I had every right." The gavel struck once, sharp as a gunshot. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore," the judge commanded. "The property is not yours, nor will it ever be. It belongs solely to Mrs. Whitmore." David's face flushed crimson as murmurs rippled through the gallery. Neighbors shook their heads, some whispering audibly. Megan shifted in her seat behind him, eyes darting downward, ashamed. Eleanor didn't flinch, didn't look at him. She simply rested her hands on her lap, calm in her victory. As the hearing adjourned, people rose from the benches, the shuffle of shoes filling the chamber. Eleanor stood slowly, James guiding her toward the aisle. Martha followed, her voice pitched just enough for David to hear. "You can scream all you want, boy. But the law doesn't answer tantrums." David's fists clenched so tight his knuckles cracked. He glared at Eleanor's retreating figure, his teeth grinding as he spat loud enough to echo off the courtroom walls. "This isn't over. I'll make you pay for this. You'll regret every minute of it." The threat hung in the air, jagged and poisonous, as the bailiff stepped closer, ready to intervene. Eleanor walked on without turning back, her silence a wall David could not break. The phone rang late on a Tuesday night, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet of Eleanor's living room. She let the machine pick it up, expecting another neighbor's kind words, or perhaps a reminder about her quilting circle. Instead, David's voice erupted, jagged and venomous, blasting from the speaker. "You think you've won, old woman? You're nothing without me. You hear me? Nothing. I'll drag your name through the dirt until no one remembers you. You'll regret crossing me. Everybody will know what a bitter fraud you are." The words dissolved into incoherent shouting, his rage boiling over in curses so loud the machine crackled. Then the line went dead, leaving only the low hum of silence. Eleanor stood still, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. Martha, who had been leafing through a magazine on the couch, snapped her head up, eyes blazing. "Well, there's your sainted grandson. Exhibit A and how not to be relevant." Without a word, Eleanor pressed a button, forwarding the voicemail directly to James O'Connor's inbox. Her movements were precise, calm, like a teacher marking the final red X on a failed exam. The next morning, James played the recording in his office, the harsh sound filling the space. He listened without expression, though his eyes narrowed behind his glasses. When it ended, he exhaled slowly. "This isn't just an outburst," James said. "It's intimidation. And intimidation has consequences." He filed the voicemail as evidence, attaching it to Eleanor's ongoing case. His voice, even as he explained, carried an edge of grim satisfaction. "We'll make sure the judge hears every word." Eleanor sat across from him, her face composed. "He wanted to erase me with his voice," she murmured. "Now it will be the very thing that condemns him." In court 2 days later, the recording echoed through the chamber, each word, each curse hung heavy in the polished wood air. People shifted uncomfortably in the gallery. Even the bailiff's jaw tightened at the venom spilling from the speakers. David sat rigid, his face red, fists clenched on the table. Megan was absent, her usual place behind him empty. The embarrassment had finally proven too much. When the recording ended, the judge fixed David with a glare that could have cut stone. "Mr. Whitmore, this behavior is unacceptable. Further intimidation, calls, messages, threats of any kind, will result in contempt charges. Do you understand me?" David muttered something under his breath, but the gavel struck once, silencing him. From the gallery, Cal shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. He stood torn between the mother who had raised him and the son unraveling before his eyes. His hands twisted together, his lips pressing into a thin line as though he might split in two. Eleanor, seated with James and Martha, didn't so much as glance at David. Her posture remained tall, her expression unreadable, as though his outburst had never existed. Outside the courthouse, Lila Rhodes approached Eleanor with her recorder. "The town wants to know how you feel, Mrs. Whitmore. Do you think justice is being served?" Eleanor considered her words carefully, then smiled faintly. "Respect can't be demanded. It has to be earned. And if it's denied, then justice fills the space." The next morning, Lila's follow-up appeared in the Tulsa Times. "Respect denied, justice served." The article painted David's threats against Eleanor in sharp relief, contrasting his rage with her calm resilience. Community support swelled again, neighbors dropping by with casseroles, strangers stopping her on the street to praise her strength. Meanwhile, David's silence online was deafening. His once bold posts vanished, deleted in a storm of shame. Yet Eleanor knew the quiet was not surrender. It was only the eye of the storm. Late one evening, James visited Eleanor at her home. The lamp on her end table cast a golden circle across the room. The rest swallowed in shadow. Martha dozed in the armchair, the faint ticking of the clock filling the quiet. James leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "The next hearing is final. His last chance. After that, everything will be sealed, and there'll be no undoing it." Eleanor lifted her teacup, her hand steady, her voice calm. "Then let it be his undoing." The gavel cracked once, calling the courtroom to order, but the tension had already been building like a storm behind closed windows. David sat at the defense table, no attorney beside him. His tie hung crooked, his hair mussed as if he hadn't slept. He had announced, loudly, defiantly, that he would represent himself. From the gallery, whispers rippled. Eleanor sat across the aisle, James at her side, Martha poised just behind her. The faint scent of lemon oil on the polished benches, mixed with the sharper smell of sweat from the crowd. Everyone knew this would not be a quiet hearing. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge began, voice firm but measured. "You may proceed with your opening remarks." David shot to his feet, his voice already raised. "This entire case is a sham. My grandmother is being manipulated by that lawyer and her meddling friend." He jabbed a finger toward James, then swung it toward Martha. "They're poisoning her mind, turning her against her own blood." The judge's gavel struck once. "Mr. Whitmore, lower your tone. This is a court of law." David gritted his teeth, pacing in front of the table. "Fine. But everyone here knows she's not thinking clearly. You don't just erase family without losing your grip." "Enough," the judge said sharply. "You will speak to the evidence, not sling accusations." James rose calmly, his papers in hand, his tone the steady contrast to David's storm. "Your Honor, we have more than accusations. We have documentation, recordings, and sworn affidavits." He laid out photographs, Eleanor's quilts at the museum, her scholarship plaque, gleaming at the Civic Center. He followed with the voicemail David had left, the insults pouring from the speakers once more, making the gallery shift uncomfortably. David leapt up, shouting over the sound. "That was taken out of context. I was angry. She pushed me. Sit down, the judge ordered. James continued as if David weren't there. We have pawnshop records, signed receipts, and police reports tracing stolen property directly back to Mr. Whitmore. We have testimony from neighbors, students, and colleagues confirming Mrs. Whitmore's clarity and reputation. He turned slightly toward Eleanor, his voice softening. And we have her own words. The judge nodded. Mrs. Whitmore, please take the stand. Eleanor rose, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She carried herself with quiet authority, every step deliberate. When she took her seat, the oath still fresh in the air, she looked not at David but at the judge. I was called irrelevant, she began, her voice clear, steady. Not in private, but in public. My own grandson tried to erase me with laughter. She paused, scanning the room, her gaze sharp but calm. But I am not irrelevant. I am the archive he tried to erase. The photographs, the quilts, the history I carried. He tried to sell them as if memory were scrap metal. I've taught generations the value of history, and I won't let mine be discarded. The gallery stirred, murmurs rising like a tide. A few nodded, others whispered words of agreement. David shot to his feet, face scarlet, veins pulsing at his temples. This is manipulation. She's acting for the crowd. She's always been dramatic. Mr. Whitmore, the judge barked, slamming the gavel. One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. David sank back down, his chest heaving, eyes darting wildly around the courtroom, as though searching for someone who still believed him. Megan was absent again. Cal sat in the back row, shoulders slumped, his face caught between shame and sorrow. When Eleanor stepped down from the stand, James collected his papers, his expression controlled but confident. The judge shuffled notes, eyes scanning the file before her. The room fell silent, the anticipation sharp enough to cut through the air. This matter is adjourned until tomorrow morning, the judge announced finally. The verdict will be delivered then. The gavel struck once more. The sound echoed like the toll of a bell, leaving the courtroom suspended in breathless silence. David sat frozen, his fists clenched, his glare fixed on Eleanor as though he could will her away. But Eleanor walked calmly from the courtroom, her steps unhurried, her resolve unshaken. Tomorrow would decide everything. The courtroom was hushed, the air heavy with anticipation. Even the creak of the judge's chair as she entered sounded louder than usual. She carried a stack of papers under one arm, her expression carved in stone. Every eye followed her as she ascended to the bench, the rustle of her robe the only sound. Be seated, she said, her voice firm. The gallery shifted, the scrape of benches echoing like thunder. David sat stiff at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting from the judge to Eleanor across the aisle. Eleanor remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Martha sat just behind her, lips pressed together in the sharp composure. James O'Connor was steady, pen poised, his papers aligned with military precision. The judge cleared her throat, glancing at the documents before her. This court has reviewed the evidence presented, theft reports, pawnshop records, recorded threats, as well as testimony regarding Mrs. Whitmore's competency and legacy. Based on this, the court issues the following ruling. The silence deepened. Even the clock seemed to hesitate between ticks. First, the judge said, her tone deliberate, the will and trust established by Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore are valid and irrevocable. David Whitmore is hereby legally disinherited and excluded by name. He has no claim to her estate, present or future. The word struck like a hammer. David's mouth fell open, his hands gripping the table edge until his knuckles blanched. A murmur swept through the gallery, a current of disbelief and satisfaction mingling. The judge continued, her gaze unwavering. Second, theft charges brought against David Whitmore are upheld. The court sentences him to probation with mandatory restitution to Mrs. Whitmore for the value of stolen property. David shot to his feet, voice cracking. This is insane! It's still family property. The gavel slammed once, sharp as a rifle shot. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore. You are fortunate the charges stop at probation." He collapsed back into his chair, face red, veins pulsing at his temples. His shoulders twitched with rage he couldn't contain. The judge's voice softened slightly as she addressed Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore, your trust is secure. Its terms cannot be altered or contested. Your assets will remain beyond the reach of those who would misuse them." Eleanor inclined her head, a faint nod of gratitude. Her hand reached back, finding Martha's, their fingers clasping tightly. In the back row, Cal sat with his head bowed, shame heavy in the slope of his shoulders. His silence was louder than any plea he might have made. He had defended his son for too long, and now the verdict had stripped away every excuse. The judge closed the file, but then paused. Her eyes swept the room, landing on David, whose chest heaved with fury, his lips pressed into a bitter line. "There is one more matter," she said, her tone cool as steel. The room stilled again. "In light of Mr. Whitmore's repeated misconduct, the court orders that he pay all legal fees associated with these proceedings." A collective intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Even James's pen stilled above his notes. The judge's words cut on. "These fees are substantial and will be enforced in full, reducing Mr. Whitmore's savings and assets to near exhaustion." David's face drained of color, his bravado faltering for the first time. His lips parted, but no words came. Megan, sitting several rows back, buried her face in her hands. Cal closed his eyes, as though he couldn't bear to witness the collapse of his son any longer. The gavel struck again, final and unyielding. "Court is adjourned." The gallery rose in a wave of movement, murmurs swelling into low conversation. Eleanor remained seated for a moment, still holding Martha's hand, the weight of the moment settling over her like a quilt stitched from decades of resolve. David stayed frozen, his body rigid, staring at the judge's bench as though willing it to reverse. But there was no reversal. The verdict was written, signed, and sealed. Eleanor rose at last, her dignity intact, her composure unbroken. She walked past David without a glance, the sound of her heels measured and steady against the floor. Behind her, David's voice finally broke. A hoarse whisper turned curse. "This isn't the end. You'll see. You'll all see." But the threat sounded smaller now, hollow against the echo of the ruling that had stripped him bare. David had always been loudest when he felt weakest, but in the days following the verdict, his silence was what unnerved people most. He didn't post online. He didn't show his face at the Civic Center or the neighborhood bar. When friends texted, he snapped back with clipped answers until the invitations stopped coming altogether. By the end of the week, his phone was silent. At a coffee shop downtown, two of his old buddies scrolled through the article about the ruling, shaking their heads. "Man, he really thought he could take her on," one muttered, sipping his latte. "Lost everything. Even had to pay her lawyer bills," the other laughed uneasily. "Makes you wonder what he'll do now." Guy's radioactive word traveled fast in Tulsa. By the time David showed up at the bar on Friday night, expecting sympathy, the crowd looked through him. Conversations paused when he walked in, then resumed in lowered tones. A bartender he'd known for years shook his head and slid him a watered-down beer without charge, more pity than camaraderie. At home, Megan's patience snapped. She stood in the living room, suitcase open on the couch, folding clothes with quick, decisive movements. "I can't keep living like this," she said, voice sharp but trembling underneath. "You've turned us into a public joke," everyone whispers when I walk into the salon. At the club, they pretend I don't exist. "I'm done, David?" He gaped at her, the anger gone, replaced with panic. "You're leaving me? After everything? You're supposed to stand by me, stand by you while you steal silverware and scream at your grandmother on voicemails?" Megan snapped, slamming the suitcase shut. "No, I won't drown just because you insist on sinking." The door closed behind her, the sound echoing through the apartment like a final gavel. 2 weeks later, Cal came by with boxes. His eyes were bloodshot, his frame weary. David assumed foolishly that his father was there to help him pick up the pieces. Instead, Cal's first words drained what little hope David clung to. "I can't do this anymore," Cal said quietly, setting a box of his belongings on the floor. "I've defended you, excused you, covered for you. But you've crossed lines I can't ignore." "You're my father," David said, voice cracking. "You're supposed to fight for me." "I did," Cal admitted, shoulders sagging. "But at some point, fighting for you meant losing myself. I'm moving out. You're on your own." The boxes stacked by the door looked heavier than their contents. When Cal walked out, David didn't follow. He sat in the hollow silence of the apartment, the echo of abandonment pressing in from every corner. While David's world shrank, Eleanor's expanded. A month after the verdict, the Tulsa Public Library unveiled its newest edition, the Richard Whitmore Wing. The air smelled of fresh paint and new carpet as townspeople gathered in the glass-walled atrium, sipping lemonade from plastic cups, listening to speeches. A bronze plaque glimmered in the entryway, dedicated in honor of Richard Whitmore, whose legacy lives on through knowledge, history, and memory. Eleanor stood beside it, Martha on one side, James on the other. She didn't need to speak. The applause said enough. Children ran fingers along the new bookshelves. Former students greeted her warmly, their voices carrying gratitude. In the corner, Lila Rhodes snapped photographs, her smile as sharp as her questions had been weeks earlier. The next morning, her full feature ran in the Tulsa Times. Erased, remembered, rewritten, it told the story from beginning to end. The insult, the erasure, the reclamation. Eleanor's quilts and lessons, Richard's memory, the scholarship, the courtroom battles. It was all there, woven into a narrative that painted her as both survivor and architect of her own justice. That evening, Eleanor and Martha sat on Eleanor's porch as the sky faded into streaks of orange and pink. A quilt lay across their laps, soft against the cooling air. Crickets chirped from the grass, the world slowing into the hush of twilight. "You've stitched your name into this town forever," Martha said quietly. "He tried to tear it out, but look at you now." Eleanor didn't answer. She watched the horizon, the last traces of sun dipping below it, her hand smoothing the quilt's familiar seams. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was contentment. A calm earned through fire. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Eleanor's email pinged. She opened her laptop, the glow lighting her lined face. A new message sat at the top of her inbox from Lila Rhodes. "Readers are asking," it began. "What does relevance mean to you now?" Eleanor stared at the question, her reflection faint in the darkened screen, the weight of it lingering like a challenge she wasn't finished answering. The park was quiet that morning, the lake smooth as glass under a pale sky. Ducks skimmed across the water, leaving ripples that spread outward in slow circles. Eleanor sat on a bench near the shore, her scarf tugged gently by the breeze, her cane resting beside her. She had chosen this place carefully. It was where she and Richard used to walk on Sunday mornings, where their footsteps had carved a rhythm into the gravel path. Lila Rhodes approached with her recorder tucked in her bag and a notebook balanced against her palm. She looked almost hesitant, as though afraid to intrude on something sacred. "Mrs. Whitmore," Lila said softly, "thank you for meeting me here." Eleanor gestured to the empty spot beside her. "If we're going to talk about relevance, it should be somewhere that remembers more than it forgets." They sat together in the cool air, the faint scent of damp earth rising from the grass. Lila clicked her pen, her eyes searching Eleanor's face. Readers keep asking the same question. After everything, what does relevance mean to you now? Eleanor gazed across the lake, the water shifting with the wind. When she spoke, her voice was steady, rich with years. Relevance is what you leave stitched into others' lives. Not applause, not inheritance, not even your name on a plaque. It's the hand you hold steady, the lesson you pass on, the memory that warms someone long after you're gone. David thought relevance was measured in what you own. I know it's measured in what you give, Lila wrote quickly, her pen racing across the page. But Eleanor's words weren't meant for ink alone. They hung in the air, carried by the sound of lapping water and the cries of distant gulls. That evening, Martha arrived at Eleanor's house with a package wrapped in brown paper. "Don't fuss," she said when Eleanor tried to protest. "It's not much. Just something you ought to have inside," was a simple frame, polished wood holding a photograph. The young woman in the picture stood at a podium, her smile nervous but proud, holding a certificate that read, "The Richard Whitmore Legacy Scholarship, First Recipient." Eleanor traced the frame with her fingertips, her chest tightening. "She looks so young she's the first," Martha said, settling into the armchair. "There'll be dozens more, maybe hundreds. That's relevance, Eleanor. You've stitched his name, and yours, into futures you won't even live to see." Eleanor placed the frame above the mantel, beside Richard's pocket watch and their wedding photograph. The three images, past, present, and future, seemed to speak to each other in silence. The following week, Cal came to the house. He didn't call ahead. He stood on the porch like a boy again, shoulders bent, eyes downcast. Eleanor opened the door, saying nothing, waiting. "Mom," Cal began, his voice rough, I was wrong about everything. I defended David when I should have stopped him. I excused him because I thought it was easier. But I see now what that cost you." His eyes glistened, his words stumbling. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to tell you that I'm sorry." Eleanor held the door frame, her face unreadable. She studied him for a long moment, the weight of silence heavier than any response. Finally, she stepped aside, not to let him in, but to let herself walk past him. She moved toward the garden, leaving Cal on the porch with only the sound of the wind in the trees. That night, alone in her living room, Eleanor opened Richard's Bible. The leather was worn, the pages soft from years of touch. On the inside cover, his inscription remained clear, written in his steady hand. "To live remembered, live rightly." She closed the book gently, setting it back on the shelf. The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows flickering across the framed photograph of the scholarship recipient above the mantel. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the quilt Martha had left draped across her lap. Her eyes softened, but her voice, spoken only to the quiet room, carried the sharp finality of a verdict. "He erased my seat at his table. I erased his name from my future.